I like a lot of genres, and I like talking about those genres, obviously. What influences trends in those genres, how those stories change with time, and why society tends to certain motifs in them really interests me. One of the genres that's easiest to track is horror. What scares us individually and as a culture. That's what we often use as motivation for our horror stories. And one thing I like to do is see what subgenres of horror were popular throughout history and postulate what may have made them popular. What did the originators of these archetypes find so scary about them? Vampires, at least the traditional Eastern European kind of vampire, they are associated with night, bats, and blood. Bats are admittedly hard to see sometimes, so even though as animals they are very helpful to humans, they can catch you by surprise, so a lot of people associate them with fear. Blood is something that you can't lose too much of, so a lot of people are afraid of seeing it outside of the body. Night makes it harder to see, and crime is often committed at night, so I get why people feared this combination. But socially, which is what I find much more interesting, vampires are associated with wealth. Let's take a look. Now, you're probably familiar with the stereotype of the rich vampire. Dracula, Ruthven, Robbie, Varney, Carmilla, etc. It's pretty much accepted that vampires are rich, unilaterally. But peculiarly, I found in my research that in their folkloric origins, vampires were associated with a lack of wealth rather than an abundance. The beginning of the vampire craze in Serbia was centered around the death and supposed resurrection and vampirism of Petar Blagojevic and Arnold Paule. Both of these individuals were peasants, and Paule was possibly a Turk. Jewish and Roma people were often associated with vampires as well, with the former being a variation of a canard alleging, falsely of course, that Jewish people stole the blood of Christians, and the latter coming from the fear of the supposed magic that the Roma were believed to hold. These associations, based not in truth but in hatred, contributed to and were referenced by Nazis and modern white supremacists, which is horrible. Why, then, if the origin of these characters is othering and prejudice, concerned with maintaining oppressive structures rather than criticizing them, has the vampire become a stand-in for what is basically the privileged landlord? Well, I think when the transition from folklore to pop culture occurred, the individuals telling and recording these stories shifted, from monks and scribes to writers. Nowadays, we associate entertainment with the rich and famous, but individuals like Bram Stoker, Sheridan Le Fanu, and James Planché came from working-class families, with Le Fanu himself having an aunt dying in medical debt and a first cousin once removed in debtor's prison. John William Polidori, the creator of Ruthven, though personally well off, ended up serving as a personal physician for Lord Byron, an abusive noble who is actually likely the inspiration for the predatory vampire. A handful of individuals were able to turn around the public idea of a vampire from a dangerous vagabond to a manipulative bourgeois. Thematically, this works as well, because the wealthy are only able to maintain their wealth by draining wealth from the poor, just like a vampire is only able to maintain their immortality by draining blood from those who are mortal. Not to mention, Karl Marx himself compared capitalists to vampires well after Polidori made his vampire a capitalist. Of course, these stories still often relied on othering. Carmilla, as a story, is lesbophobic, and the fact that people claim the titular pedophile as positive representation disgusts me. Dracula has an army of willing Roma servants, despite the historical Vlad Tepes, upon whom Dracula was based, actually enslaving Roma individuals, and these problems, in varying ways, plague the vampire subgenre to this day. Werewolves are another shifting trend in horror. Originally a generic monster meant to represent the dangers of the wild, which, though wolves don't attack humans, as they attack livestock, I understand people's trepidation around them. However, werewolves truly became interesting when they went from stories meant to scare kids away from wandering off the beaten path to stories about the human soul. With novels like Alexandre Dumas' The Wolf Leader, they became a metaphor for the darkness of the human mind. Despite our best efforts, there's times when we feel like we can't control ourselves. The horror comes from not being able to stop that, and from our unintended actions hurting others. But as time went on, the 19th century social monsters were seen in new lights. Fear was replaced by sexual desire, and with no small part thanks to the sexual revolution, taboo was eroticized. Carmilla became a lesbian sex symbol for some, despite being a child rapist in her origins. Werewolves have also been sexualized, with a severe misunderstanding of wolf behavior often used as a weird sexual system. Both are very popular romantic characters, especially among women. In fact, I checked Barnes & Noble's best-selling vampire novels of the last month, and of the top 30, 29 have either a werewolf or a vampire as a love interest to the main character. I've seen some say that this is good, leading us towards acceptance of those that are different and othered. This is a strange argument to me. Even if it was true that vampires still represented marginalized individuals, which I personally don't think they do, no people group is inherently dangerous, meaning trying to compare them to vampires is ridiculous, and finding vampires sexy has nothing to do with how tolerant you are. I mean, go ahead, but it doesn't make you a good person. Plus, we've also seen how this works in the opposite way. Modern vampire fiction is largely, though admittedly not entirely, created by and for white women, and vampires oftentimes are portrayed as incredibly pale, incredibly wealthy, and incredibly influential. I'm not saying if you find this type of vampire attractive it means anything, but the literature often idolizes whiteness, wealth, and power. Consider how many white girls develop crushes on Confederate soldier Jasper Cullen in Twilight. Meanwhile, werewolves are often exotified and eroticized, with racism directed specifically towards indigenous men being unfortunately common. See my video on the Twilight Renaissance for a more complete summary of the topic. Still, as times changed, so did the focus of horror. In the wake of the Spanish flu in the 1920s, scary evil doctors and body horror became popular, as well as the works of HP Lovecraft, to a lesser extent, who was both very xenophobic and pushed the idea of cosmic horror. An unseeable, unstoppable force, a lot like a virus. I can't say that these stories were inspired by the Spanish flu, but the fears that gripped the survivors of the pandemic also show up in the horror created in the years that followed. More identifiable, though, is the inspiration for the kaiju genre. Though obviously giant monsters are nothing new, and technically King Kong predates them, Lowry's Rhidosaurus, Honda's Gojira, and Gordon's octopus are awakened by nuclear weapons. Though nowadays it's more spectacle than horror, the origin of the kaiju genre was very much based in a fear of the repercussions of atomic bombs, and there's a reason that the genre was extremely popular in Japan. But as time went on, medical horror and kaiju became less popular, replaced with the psychological thrillers of the 50s and 60s and the slasher movies of the 70s and 80s. Though techno-horror was around back in the 50s, it really took off in the 90s with Ringu, and remains one of the most popular subgenres of horror to this day, in my opinion. Granted, I would include the found footage films in the vein of the Blair Witch Project to be techno-horror as well, so maybe not everybody would agree. Of course, with the 2000s came the era of nostalgia. Reboots and remakes became increasingly popular, as well as homages to subgenres long thought exhausted or overplayed. Trying to summarize a single most popular horror film genre for either of the last 2 decades is nearly impossible, as fans tend to gravitate towards stories over a shared subgenre. Will this remain the case? As the horror of the 1920s was shaped by the Spanish flu, will the horror of the 2020s be shaped by the coronavirus? Will medical horror resurface, or will pandemic horror become unhistorically popular? Maybe. Many in quarantine have taken to streaming services to consume pandemic horror that may not have been interesting to them before this year. But does that mean we'll create new pandemic horror? Who knows? One thing is for certain, though. Horror has been a part of the world's culture for millennia, and likely will continue to be. There's multiple theories as to why we love horror specifically, and not just drama centered around these topics, but I wouldn't pretend to be a psychologist. What I can say, though, is that horror works best, like many other genres, when it is used as a tool to critique power, not demonize the powerless. With every subgenre, there have been those that have used horror as a way to provide voices for the marginalized, but also those that have used horror to make you associate fear with people different than you. As you consume horror, it would be my suggestion that you recognize how the author works, what they want you to be afraid of, and if it is in the interest of everyone to accept those fears or not.